There are some voices that seem stitched into the very fabric of American memory. Soft, steady, with just enough ache to stir something long forgotten. Ricky Nelson's voice was one of them. He did not shout to be heard. He sang gently and the world listened. From living rooms in the 1950s to radios in the rebellious 60s, he was both the golden boy next door and the quiet rebel who carved his own path through a shifting cultural landscape. But like many stars shaped under the intense heat of early fame, Ricky's light flickered in ways few ever saw. His was a life lived on camera, first as a boy in a picture-perfect family sitcom, then as a teenage heartthrob whose records flew off store shelves. Yet behind the soft smile and slicked hair was a man shouldering private burdens, searching for peace amid the noise of applause. Fame had come quickly, built not only on his own talent, but on the sturdy foundation of the Nelson family name. And for a while, it seemed as if his story might be one of rare success. A child star who grew gracefully into adulthood. That illusion, like so many crafted in Hollywood, would not last. On the last day of 1985, as the world prepared to ring in a new year, Ricky Nelson boarded a vintage aircraft with his fiancée, Helen Blair, and members of his band. They were headed to a concert in Dallas, one of many stops on a comeback tour that had begun to rekindle the warmth of his early fame. But the journey would end in tragedy. Somewhere above the fields of Texas, fire consumed the aircraft, and Ricky's life, along with 6 others, came to a quiet and horrifying end. He was just 45. The news struck with the weight of disbelief. Ricky Nelson, who had grown up before the eyes of a nation, who had sung love songs with boyish conviction, who had become an early architect of American rock and roll, was gone. And just like that, an entire era felt a little more distant. But his story didn't end with his passing. In many ways, that was only the beginning of a more complex tale, one of family legacy, romantic devotion, financial ambition, and the slow unraveling of a carefully cultivated image. Behind the neatly framed shots of the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, there were private quarrels. Behind the shimmering lights of the stage, there were debts, disagreements, and dreams that never quite came true. In this story, we return to the world Ricky Nelson built and the homes he left behind. We'll trace the quiet corridors of the houses that once echoed with music and laughter, and we'll meet the people who walked beside him during the brightest and darkest chapters of his life. From his boyhood homes in New Jersey to his television-famous residence in Los Angeles, from early romances to a controversial final love, we'll follow the trail of a man who tried, until the very end, to find his place between the spotlight and the shadows. This is the untold story of Ricky Nelson, a voice once full of promise, now carried on the wind. Long before their image was etched onto television screens across America, the Nelsons were a family of performers, a husband and wife who turned their shared talent into something enduring. Ozzie Nelson, a former Rutgers football star turned big band leader, was both charming and meticulous. His wife, Harriet, was a gifted vocalist with an elegant stage presence. Together, they weren't just entertainers, they were architects of a very particular kind of American dream, one built on harmony, both musical and domestic. Their journey began not in the studios of Hollywood, but in the humbler confines of the radio waves. In the early 1940s, as America was gripped by war and uncertainty, radio was a lifeline. Families gathered in their living rooms to laugh, cry, and feel something hopeful. Ozzie and Harriet, already seasoned performers, became regulars on the Red Skelton Show, where their chemistry, both on and off the microphone, resonated with listeners. But it was when Red Skelton was drafted into military service in 1944 that Ozzie saw an opportunity and took it. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet premiered on radio that same year, not as a spectacle, but as something tender. It was a dramatized version of their real lives. Ozzie, the well-meaning father, Harriet, the wise and gentle mother, and their 2 sons, David and Ricky. At first, the boys were played by child actors, but in time, the real David and Ricky stepped into their own roles, blending performance with reality in a way that felt natural and quietly groundbreaking. The show was a modest success at first, but something about its simplicity, its focus on small domestic moments, its quiet humor, resonated deeply with post-war America. These weren't untouchable celebrities, they were a reflection of who the audience aspired to be. A family bound by affection, laughter, and understanding. And behind the curtain, the Nelsons worked diligently to maintain that image. Ozzie wrote and directed much of the show. Harriet served as its emotional compass, and the boys, though young, adapted quickly to the rhythms of performance. As the radio show gained popularity, so too did the pressures of show business. By the late 1940s, it became clear that New York and New Jersey, where the Nelsons had once tried to maintain a quieter suburban life, could no longer contain the scope of their ambitions. The family uprooted and moved west to Los Angeles, chasing proximity to the expanding entertainment world. It was a decision that would reshape not only their lives, but the future of television itself. In 1952, with radio still strong but television growing rapidly, Ozzy made a bold move. He proposed turning their radio show into a television series, one that used the same cast, the same setting, and the same blend of scripted reality. The Adventures of Ozzy and Harriet debuted on ABC that fall, and almost instantly, it became a cultural landmark. Here was a family who seemed to live just down the street, whose disagreements were gentle, whose love was constant, whose lives mirrored a suburban ideal. But what audiences didn't know was how carefully that image was maintained. Behind the warm laughs and gentle music was a family navigating the very real pressures of public life, of raising children in the spotlight, of preserving a brand that had become, in many ways, more powerful than the individuals within it. And at the center of it all, growing up quietly under the watchful gaze of cameras and parents, was Ricky. For most families, a house is simply a place to live. But for the Nelsons, their home on 1822, Camino Palmero Street became something more, part sanctuary, part stage, and eventually a symbol stitched into the fabric of American television history. Tucked away in the quiet hills of Los Angeles, not far from the glow of Hollywood Boulevard, the Nelsons' Cape Cod-style home stood modest yet proud. White clapboard siding, green shutters, a steeply pitched roof, its charm was timeless. It didn't glitter like the estates of movie stars, nor did it flaunt its importance. But it was warm, inviting, and familiar, just like the family who lived there. When The Adventures of Ozzy and Harriet made its transition from radio to television in 1952, Ozzy made a subtle yet powerful creative choice. Rather than using a studio lot or a fictionalized facade, he filmed the show's exterior shots at their actual home. The image of that front lawn, those well-kept bushes, the sloped walkway leading to the front door, it became instantly recognizable. For 14 years, viewers would watch each episode and feel as though they were being welcomed into the Nelson household, not just as audience members, but as neighbors. This blending of private life and public performance was nearly unprecedented at the time. The line between reality and fiction blurred, making the Nelsons not just actors in a sitcom, but living embodiments of the roles they played. Ozzy wasn't just the character of the father. He truly was the father. Ricky wasn't merely pretending to be a teenage son with musical dreams. He was living that very journey, in real time, inside the very house being shown on screen. Inside the home, wood-paneled walls and cozy corners offered a comforting backdrop for the real rhythm of their daily lives. There were family dinners, late-night conversations, and piano rehearsals echoing through the halls. Holidays were spent by the fireplace, and the pool outside became a summer refuge for the boys and their friends. But behind these warm moments was the quiet weight of expectation. For the Nelsons, every part of their home had to serve two purposes. It needed to be lived in, and it needed to reflect the image America had come to expect. As Ricky grew older and began to nurture his musical talents, the family adapted part of the property into a space all his own. The pool house was transformed into a makeshift recording studio, a small oasis where he could experiment freely, away from the pressures of the main house and the ever-watchful public eye. It was in that quiet corner that many of Ricky's earliest hits began to take shape, a boy's dreams finding voice in a room that had once been built for leisure. The Camino Palmero house stood as more than just shelter. It was the frame around a living portrait of the American family. To millions, it represented stability and grace, an anchor in a fast-changing world. But to the Nelsons, it was also a place of complexity, where family, fame, and identity overlapped in ways that weren't always easy to navigate. As the cameras rolled and the front door opened each week, it welcomed the nation inside. But when the lights dimmed and the world stopped watching, it remained what it had always quietly been, a home. Imperfect, evolving, and full of stories left behind in every room. He was born Eric Hilliard Nelson on May 8, 1940, a second son in a family already deep in the rhythms of show business. But before the world would know him as Ricky, before the fame and the records and the screams from adoring fans, he was simply a quiet boy with wide eyes, a delicate constitution, and a tendency to shrink from the spotlight that would one day become his home. From the start, Ricky was not like his older brother David. Where David was outgoing and confident, Ricky was reserved, almost fragile. He suffered from severe asthma, often spending sleepless nights breathing through a vaporizer that filled his bedroom with the scent of evergreen. His mother, Harriet, watched over him tenderly, while Ozzy, ever the planner, quietly wondered whether his youngest would ever be strong enough for the demands of a public life. And yet, there was something magnetic about Ricky even then. Family friends and early producers described him as unusual, not in behavior but in presence. He had a softness, an inward gaze, as if he were already thinking his way around the edges of the world rather than charging through the center of it. That quiet nature made his eventual stardom all the more remarkable. When he was just 8 years old, Ricky joined the family radio show, lending his real voice to the fictionalized version of his life. By 12, he was on television, growing up before a nation's eyes. His lines were often short, his delivery understated. But there was an authenticity to him that no acting class could teach. He wasn't playing a role, he was simply being himself. Still, the pressures of performing at such a young age were not without cost. Ricky attended local public schools in Los Angeles, including Hollywood High, where he maintained decent grades and played on the football team. But he never felt at ease. In later interviews, he would recall hating school, not out of rebellion, but because it felt disconnected from the world he already inhabited. While his classmates studied civics and algebra, Ricky was learning to navigate fame, financial responsibility, and the subtle demands of being a public figure. At home, his parents managed his earnings with careful discipline. Though he was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars by his mid-teens, Ricky was given only a modest weekly allowance. On more than one occasion, he found himself short on money for simple pleasures like a movie date, resorting to returning soda bottles for spare change. It was a grounding experience, perhaps deliberately orchestrated by Ozzy and Harriet, to keep him humble in a world that would not always be kind. But music was where Ricky found himself. It began as a kind of rebellion, his way of standing apart from the family machine. While his parents shaped the show, Ricky shaped his sound. He was drawn to rockabilly and the early rumblings of rock and roll, a genre still considered risky for a family-oriented image. But when he performed his first song on national television, the reaction was electric. Record sales soared, and Ricky Nelson was no longer just a supporting character in a sitcom. He was a star in his own right. By 17, he had multiple hits on the charts. Girls screamed his name, and boys tried to imitate his cool, effortless style. Yet the boy behind the curtain remained, in many ways, unchanged. He was still shy, still soft-spoken, still the child who had once needed a vaporizer to sleep. In a world that so often devoured its young, Ricky walked a delicate line between the image and the individual. And in doing so, he began a journey that would carry him far beyond his family's shadow, but never fully out of its reach. In the golden haze of 1950s Hollywood, when youth and fame often collided like sparks on a reel of film, Ricky Nelson found himself swept into the tender whirlwind of first love. Beneath the suit jackets and calm television presence was a young man learning to navigate emotions as new and disorienting as the stardom that surrounded him. He was still a teenager when the first whispers of romance began to swirl. In 1957, Ricky met Marian Gaba, a beautiful, vivacious actress and model who had recently joined the cast of The Adventures of Ozzy and Harriet for a few episodes. Gaba would later be crowned Miss Illinois and go on to grace the pages of Playboy. But in that moment, she was simply Marianne, a girl with a bright laugh and a magnetic ease. Their chemistry on screen translated effortlessly off it. Though young and still uncertain of who they were, the connection was undeniable. Gaba would later recall those days with gentle fondness, describing long, innocent evenings spent together, where the world shrank to the space between them. "We used to neck for hours," she once said, a glimpse into the tender passion of two teenagers caught in a moment both sweet and fleeting. Their romance, like many born in the early days of fame, was short-lived, but it left its mark on Ricky's emotional landscape. The following year, a different kind of love came knocking. Her name was Lori Collins, and though only 15, she was already a rising star in her own right. Alongside her brother Larry, she performed as part of the Collins Kids, a country rock duo known for their exuberant energy and musical precision. It was during appearances on Town Hall Party, a popular country music television show, that Ricky and Lori's paths crossed. Lori was not just pretty, she was radiant. With a confidence far beyond her years and a voice that could command a room, she captivated Ricky almost immediately. But what began as infatuation quickly deepened into something richer. They shared more than attraction, they shared music. Late-night writing sessions, long car rides to performances, quiet harmonies whispered over guitar chords. Lori became both muse and collaborator. Together they wrote My Gal, one of Ricky's earliest original songs, a heartfelt melody echoing the sincerity of young love. Their relationship blossomed in the brief gaps between television appearances and recording sessions. For a time, it was serious, so much so that talk of marriage began to stir. But those dreams, fragile and rushed, would not survive the reality of their circumstances. Their parents, cautious and protective, saw the risks. They were too young, the industry too demanding. And so, as quickly as it had begun, their romance began to fade. Gently, but inevitably. Still, Ricky carried those early loves with him, tucked away like pages in a scrapbook. They weren't scandalous or extravagant. They were quiet, private, and deeply formative. They offered glimpses of a heart still learning how to open, still learning the difference between love and longing. For a young man constantly in the public eye, these relationships grounded him. While fans saw the polished performer, backstage he was writing verses to remember a girl's smile, or strumming a melody inspired by a moment he couldn't quite put into words. Love, in those early years, wasn't just a feeling, it was a creative force. It gave his songs warmth. It gave his eyes that faraway glint. And it reminded him, even at the height of his fame, that he was still, in the end, just a boy falling in love. By the time Ricky Nelson reached his early 20s, he was no longer just a teen idol. He was a household name, a platinum-selling artist, and a television star whose image had been carefully cultivated since childhood. But behind the charm and the camera lights, Ricky longed for something more enduring, something quiet, domestic, and real. In December of 1961, during the glow of the holiday season, he believed he had found it. Her name was Kristen Harmon. Poised, elegant, and deeply rooted in the same world that had raised Ricky, Kristen came from a family that was, in many ways, a mirror of his own. Her father, Tom Harmon, had been a celebrated college football star and sports broadcaster. Her mother, Elise Knox, was a former actress, and her younger brother, Mark Harmon, would later become an actor himself. The Harmons and the Nelsons moved in the same circles, two all-American families shaped by the golden promise of Hollywood. A romance between Rick and Chris seemed, if not inevitable, then certainly approved. They met while still young and quickly found in each other a sense of familiarity, even safety. Both had grown up under the weight of fame and the quiet expectations that came with it. They understood instinctively what it meant to live a life under observation. When Kristen became pregnant early in their courtship, marriage soon followed. On April 20th, 1963, the couple wed in a modest ceremony. Ricky, raised Protestant, converted to Catholicism at the request of Kristen's devout family and signed a formal pledge to raise their children in the faith. For Ricky, it was a gesture of love and of surrender. Soon, Kristen joined the cast of The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, slipping seamlessly into the scripted version of their lives, just as Harriet had done years before. Their real-life love became part of the Nelson family brand, and for a time, the line between story and truth felt almost invisible. They went on to have 4 children, Tracy, who would become an actress, twin sons Gunnar and Matthew, who would later form the pop-rock duo Nelson, and their youngest, Sam. To the public, they were the perfect modern family, attractive, talented, and steeped in tradition. But behind the carefully curated image, the pressures of marriage began to weigh heavily. As Ricky's music career matured, the demands of touring increased. He was often on the road, chasing audiences and chasing income. Meanwhile, Kristen, left to manage the home, grew increasingly frustrated. She wanted him to stay in Los Angeles, to shift his focus back to acting, to be more present. But their lifestyle, lavish and fast-paced, left little room for compromise. Bills mounted, and so did emotional distance. Kristen's unhappiness deepened, and alcohol became a refuge. Arguments became more frequent. Communication broke down. The home that once represented hope and family now echoed with silence and tension. In 1977, Kristen filed for divorce. It was the beginning of a long and painful unraveling. Though there were brief reconciliations, the damage could not be undone. By December of 1982, after years of legal battles, financial strain, and emotional exhaustion, the divorce was finalized. Ricky lost over $1 million in legal fees and settlements, but the greater cost was harder to measure. He had hoped, perhaps naively, to find in marriage the kind of stability he had grown up portraying. What he found instead was how fragile that image could be. In the end, their separation left scars not just on Ricky and Kristen, but on the family they had tried to build. And as Ricky stepped into the next chapter of his life, he carried with him the quiet ache of a dream that hadn't held. After the dust of divorce settled, Ricky Nelson found himself once again in transition, no longer the boy next door, not quite the elder statesman of rock, and very much alone. It was during this uncertain period, in the early 1980s, that he met Helen Blair. She was not a household name, nor was she part of the Hollywood lineage he had grown up around. But she offered something Ricky hadn't known in some time: quiet companionship and perhaps a new beginning. Helen was a part-time model and an exotic animal trainer, a woman with a striking presence and a sense of adventure. They met in Las Vegas, and their connection was almost immediate. She was younger, sharp, attentive, and drawn to the whirlwind world Ricky still occupied. But unlike many who circled fame for its shine, Helen wasn't dazzled. She rolled up her sleeves and stepped in, not as a spectator, but as a participant. Within months, she was traveling with Ricky full-time, not just as his girlfriend, but as his assistant, his confidant, and in many ways, his anchor. She managed schedules, organized travel, and coordinated with fan clubs. To some, she was indispensable. To others, she was overstepping. The people closest to Ricky, his brother David, his mother Harriet, his longtime managers, viewed Helen with quiet suspicion. They questioned her intentions, her influence, and the closeness she had so quickly established. Tensions grew behind the scenes. Harriet, protective and reserved, never warmed to Helen. She viewed her as an outsider, perhaps even a disruption to the family's tight circle. David remained polite, but distant. Business associates saw Helen's involvement as problematic, her presence blurring the boundaries between Ricky's personal and professional life. And yet, Ricky remained steadfast. Whatever storms were brewing around her, he saw in Helen something he needed: support without judgment, order in the midst of chaos, and affection without the weight of expectation. They settled into a rhythm. While Ricky continued to tour, often performing in smaller venues across the country, Helen remained by his side. She booked hotels, helped pack gear, and kept the show running, even when finances grew tight or the audiences smaller. Through lawsuits, lingering debts, and the slow fade of fame, Helen was there. She knew his frustrations, witnessed his quiet moments, and never left. Whether out of love, loyalty, or shared resilience, she stayed. There were talks of marriage, whispered plans, but no official engagement. Perhaps the shadow of Ricky's first union loomed too large. Or perhaps, given the disapproval from those closest to him, he felt it safer to keep things as they were. Stable but unofficial, heartfelt but unspoken. Still, in the eyes of many, Helen was his partner in every meaningful way. And then, on the final day of 1985, she boarded the plane with him. She sat beside him during those final moments, unaware, as they all were, of what would unfold in the sky above Texas. After the crash, Helen's absence from the public grieving was immediate and painful. Her name was not mentioned at Ricky's funeral. She was not buried alongside him, nor was she publicly acknowledged by his family. When her parents requested that she be laid to rest near Ricky at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, Harriet Nelson declined. It was a final, firm rejection, one that cut deeply into the Blair family and perhaps into the memory of what Helen had meant to Ricky. In the years that followed, her parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against his estate. It was not just about compensation. It was about recognition. They had lost a daughter, and they believed the world should know that she had mattered, that she had loved and been loved in return. Today, Helen Blair remains a quieter figure in Ricky's story. Not a wife, not a co-star, not a headline. But in the closing chapters of his life, she was there. And in the quiet margins of his legacy, so is she. Fame, for all its dazzle, is a fleeting currency. Ricky Nelson knew this better than most. He had risen fast, earned millions while still a teenager, and watched as audiences shifted their attention to newer names and sounds. By the time he entered his 40s, he understood that applause was no guarantee of stability. And so, quietly, thoughtfully, he turned to something far more grounded: real estate. It may seem unexpected from a man best known for 3-minute songs and televised family dinners, but Ricky had long possessed a quiet instinct for preserving value. While his career had been built on image, his investments were rooted in something more practical: bricks, land, and location. One of his earliest and most significant acquisitions was a spacious home in the Hollywood Hills. It was not just another address among the palm-lined streets of Los Angeles, it was a statement. With sweeping views, high ceilings, and modern design sensibilities, the house reflected a different phase of Ricky's life. It was a departure from the wholesome image of Camino Palmero and a nod toward adulthood, independence, and perhaps reinvention. There, tucked away from the noise of the industry, Ricky found moments of peace. He hosted small gatherings, spent quiet evenings with friends and family, and used the home as both retreat and reminder that he was still someone of substance, even as the spotlight flickered. But the Hollywood Hills estate was not his only foray into property. Over time, Ricky quietly built a portfolio of real estate holdings across Southern California. He purchased modest homes, parcels of land, and income-generating properties. While not a mogul in the traditional sense, he was deliberate. He understood that success in music could be unpredictable, but the right piece of land, in the right location, had a permanence the stage could not offer. These investments became especially important in the wake of his divorce. The legal proceedings with Kristen Harmon had been long, painful, and expensive. Over $1 million had been siphoned away in legal fees and settlements. Tours, once undertaken for artistic fulfillment, became financial necessities. But through it all, Ricky's properties remained, steadily appreciating in value, quietly protecting what was left of his fortune. Real estate was more than just business. It was a form of control in a world where so much had once been decided for him. As a child, his every movement was scripted, his lines written, his image curated. But as a man, he could choose where to live, what to buy, and how to shape his surroundings. In a career defined by public consumption, real estate gave him something that was entirely his. Those homes, now scattered across maps and memory, were never mere structures. They were markers of resilience. They witnessed his reinvention, his heartbreak, his solitude, and his hope. They stood firm while the music business shifted, while relationships faltered, while headlines faded. In time, those same properties would offer something else, security for his children, a tangible legacy in place of the fragile one left behind by fame. And though Ricky Nelson may not have spoken often of investments or balance sheets, his choices revealed a quieter wisdom, that even a star must have something solid beneath their feet. By the mid-1980s, Ricky Nelson had settled into a quieter rhythm, no longer chasing chart toppers, but still performing, still drawing audiences who remembered. He wasn't filling stadiums, but he didn't need to. There was a comfort in the smaller venues, the loyal fans, the familiar chords. He called it a comeback tour, though he never made much noise about it. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was simply doing what he loved, singing. It was during one of these tours, on the final day of 1985, that Ricky boarded a plane bound for Dallas, Texas. The aircraft was a vintage Douglas DC-3, a twin-engine workhorse from an earlier era. It had character and history, but also age and, tragically, mechanical flaws. Ricky had flown in it many times before. It was familiar, like an old stage. But this time, something went terribly wrong. On board with him were his fiancée, Helen Blair, members of his band, and a road manager. They were en route to a New Year's Eve performance, one of many shows that had begun to stitch his music back into the public's ear. But somewhere over DeKalb, Texas, a fire broke out, silent at first, then spreading with terrifying speed. The cabin heater, later determined to be faulty and not up to safety codes, had ignited a blaze that filled the fuselage with smoke. Panic followed. The pilots, in a final act of desperate skill, managed to crash land the plane in an open field. They survived, but those in the cabin did not. Ricky Nelson was just 45 years old. His passing, announced in headlines across the country, felt both sudden and symbolic. One of America's first television sons, one of rock and roll's earliest icons, was gone. The nation mourned, not just for the man, but for what he represented. A bridge between two eras, a time when fame still seemed wholesome, when music still felt new. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. Questions surfaced quickly. Why was he flying in a vintage aircraft? Were there warnings? Could it have been prevented? Investigations followed, and while no foul play was found, the conclusion was chilling. A neglected heater, an outdated system, and a fire that left no time to escape. But beyond the technical findings was the heartbreak. Ricky, who had spent his life in motion, touring, evolving, reaching for something lasting, was gone in an instant, along with Helen and 5 others who had devoted themselves to the music, to the road, and to the man at the center of it all. In the days that followed, tributes poured in. Old friends, former collaborators, and fans across generations shared memories. His record spun on radios again, and old episodes of The Adventures of Ozzy and Harriet aired in quiet tribute. Yet amidst the remembrance, there were silences too. divisions among family, tensions over who was included in the mourning, and unspoken grief that lingered long after the news cycle moved on. That final flight did more than end a life. It closed a chapter in American entertainment, a gentle reminder of how fragile even the most familiar voices can be. And for those who had grown up watching Ricky Nelson, listening to him, loving him from afar, the loss was not only of a person, but of an era. Ricky Nelson never shouted for attention. He didn't burn with controversy or demand the spotlight with defiance. Instead, he moved through fame like a quiet current, steady, sincere, and sometimes aching with unspoken weight. In a world that often rewards spectacle, his gift was subtlety. He was a gentle rebel, carving a space for himself between the pristine frame of family television and the raw spirit of early rock and roll. From the moment he stepped in front of a microphone as a child, Ricky lived a life of dualities. He was both sun and star, performer and private soul, icon and introvert. Raised in a home that doubled as a set, his adolescence was preserved on film, not as a diary kept in drawers, but as public memory, endlessly rewatched and remembered. Few could have navigated such a life without losing themselves entirely. And while Ricky faltered, as anyone might, he never lost the quiet core that made his voice so distinct. His music, soft-spoken yet enduring, became the soundtrack to a generation discovering itself. Songs like Hello Mary Lou and Travelin' Man didn't scream rebellion, but they captured a shift, an opening of the door from 1950s innocence into something more modern, more honest. He sang with restraint, but also with truth. And in the end, that truth cost him more than applause could mend. The strains of family, the hunger for creative freedom, the burden of maintaining a life lived so long in public view, all of it chipped away at the tidy image. Yet even in decline, even as fame became a quieter echo, Ricky kept going. Not for glory, but for the music, for the connection, for the stage, wherever it could be found. His real estate ventures, his effort to protect something tangible for his children, his choice to bring Helen Blair into his world despite the disapproval. All of it pointed to a man still seeking control over his story. Not as an idol, but as a person. He wasn't chasing headlines anymore. He was chasing peace. And though his final journey ended in tragedy, Ricky Nelson left behind more than records and reruns. He left behind a legacy of gentle endurance. A reminder that not all stars burn out in scandal, that some simply fade with quiet dignity, their light lingering long after. Today, his name may not fill tabloids, but his songs still fill the air. His episodes still bring smiles. And his story, complicated, graceful, and human, remains a chapter worth remembering. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of Hollywood's golden era.